Welcome to the Never Border Trade podcast. I'm Vijai. I'm actually filling in for J. Paul, who's on vacation this week. And we have another special guest, Fadeel Sheikh, who's filling in for me.
Hi, I'm Fadeel Sheikh, and I'm the Policy Research Coordinator here at the Brampton Board of Trade.
And welcome to episode 34. That is wild. We've done 34 of these now. Fadeel is our summer intern at the Brampton Board of Trade. This is the first time we've had a summer intern on our podcast, and I thought it might be cool to hear your perspectives on what's going on in Brampton, especially because you are a Brampton resident. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your time in Brampton?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in Brampton for basically 24 years, so my entire life, and it's always been an adventure. I think over the course of my lifetime, I've seen Brampton through a variety of different eras. Brampton has experienced so much growth over the last, say, 20 years, and even the last 10 years because of the rise in immigration, but also the investments that Brampton's making in the economy. So it's really interesting to see, as a Brampton resident who's seen it through all these phases, understanding what has Brampton overcome over the past, but also what does the future look like for Brampton, having the optimism to see, what is on the horizon for Brampton and how Brampton's going to continue accommodating for all of this growth and turning into a big economic center in the GTHA and the Golden Horseshoe area.
Yes, and we will certainly talk more about what we're looking at in this municipal election. As young people, what are the issues affecting us in Brampton? But I just want to say that we've done some good work over the past several weeks with Leslie Wu on this workforce housing report, and I'm really excited to present that. And you've been really leading that work, so I'm really excited to have everyone see your hard work. Yeah.
Yeah,
How do you feel about how the report's coming together?
I think it's coming together really nicely. We've worked with a lot of stakeholders over the last few months, understanding really what does the workforce in Brampton need in terms of housing and how can we support those needs. I think, again, Brampton has done a lot of investments in economic growth, but understanding, investment doesn't work just in a silo. It's not going to be just you build it. You say you want to build economies and you want to build economies of scale. Is really you need to be able to support every aspect of business growth. And that includes making sure that businesses actually have access to the workforce that they're looking for. And so building sustainable housing and making it affordable for workers and making it easy for them to be able to actually access the employment and the investments that we're building up remains a critical challenge for Brampton, especially with, the massive population growth we've experienced. Navigating how do you actually work through that planning process and ensure that we are getting the right types of housing built and developing that at the pace that we need to be doing to couple that with all of the economic growth. It's one of the big questions that Brampton's going to be facing, not only now, but obviously for the next decade, 2 decades going forward. So I'm excited to continue tackling this challenge and trying to provide some good recommendations based on, evidence that actually makes sense for the Brampton case.
Yeah, and what I love about this report that we're putting together is we're really looking at it from the perspective of the middle income worker in Brampton, and what are the housing supports that this individual needs as they think about starting a family, or maybe they have a family already. They think about their commute to work. They think about if they're aspiring towards home ownership, what are some key factors that they're considering as they move through this community. So I'm really excited for that work to be published. Okay, so we want to talk about a few different things today. The first is we have some hot off the presses news with respect to trade and Donald Trump and Carney. It feels like this is we perennially return to this topic, but some big news coming out of today's deadline, really. Secondly, we want to talk about transportation infrastructure and the enabling infrastructure that allows for more housing to be built. And then we want to end with a bit of a forward look on what are the issues that are important to us in this municipal election as young people, right? As sub 40-year-olds, let's say, to include myself in there. So let's start with the trade stuff. Do you want to summarize the news?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the last couple of weeks now, as we all know, Trump has been threatening Canada with a new set of tariffs that have been on the table for quite some time. And those are supposed to kick in today. Thankfully, it seems early today that Trump was talking about that there seems to be some sort of a trade deal being worked out between the United States and Canada. And so that tariff has been paused for 3 days for now. But I think it adds that ongoing conversation of what does Canada and the United States trade future look like. I know for a long time tariffs have been kind of the status quo now for the last 2 years ever since Trump took over. And so really it's about understanding where do we go from here as obviously as a nation, but also understanding Brampton's unique economic circumstances and how does this impact businesses here. And I think the big thing is learning how to control what we can control in that space, recognizing that there's only so much the government can do in terms of influencing the tariffs. So how can we make Canada and Brampton more specifically a more economically attractive place for investment, for business development, for kind of growth in general?
Yeah.
And how do we learn to compete with the United States, who, they have been the economic engine for such a long time? So what investments can we and should we be doing right now to build that infrastructure, attract that investment, and make it to the point where having that relationship with the United States is still very helpful. And they are our biggest partner, both in trade, geographically, and as well politically. But how can we work to start bringing that investment back to Canada and be able to reinvest back in our own communities?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is a real question about how we want to maintain our relationship with the U.S. going forward. It's almost a philosophical question of, do we want to continue to be integrated with this major economy, or do we want to actually reshore, so to speak, some of our industry that has been ceded to the United States? I think the biggest bone of contention with this latest announcement um, is around alcohol, and the U.S. wants Canada to reshelve alcohol, and it's interesting because I think we haven't yet seen, or maybe we have, but I think we're starting to get to the U.S. in an interesting way, in a way that I haven't seen before, and when Mark Carney was first elected, that big sort of initial meeting at the White House, it was very complimentary. Donald Trump was very complimentary of Carney, and now we're seeing that Carney is falling quickly out of favor with Donald Trump. So I'm very curious to see what that relationship looks like. Um, I am of the opinion, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I don't think we should rush necessarily to get a deal uh, if it's going to be a bad deal for Canada. So part of this news is, look, Donald Trump he's in show business. He understands the theater of making a big announcement, and even now saying that, well, we're pausing the tariffs for 3 days. He knows what he's doing. He wants people to feel this sense of anxiety, and he knows that'll get him attention. But I do get the sense that our leadership in Canada, they're steadying the course, and they're saying, look, let's not give in to him. Let's not give in to the theatrics. Let's have let cooler heads prevail, and let's get to a deal that actually makes sense for us. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think obviously there's been conversations. Obviously, when Carney became prime minister, the big conversation was how is he going to handle Trump and how is he going to negotiate a new trade deal and work through the Kuzma negotiations. And I think a big part of the Carney strategy so far has been kind of just wait. And I think a big reason for that is, as we've seen with Trump, his foreign policy positions have been they change very often. They've been very kind of, one day you expect one thing, next day it could be completely different. And I think from a Canadian perspective, that is important to consider, given that if we are going to be going through a negotiation, we don't want to get strong armed into a bad deal just for the sake of saying we have a Kuzma deal or saying that we have a new trade deal with the United States. It's really about understanding, well, what is the true purpose for having Kuzma and free trade in Canada, United States? And so part of that means understanding what are the things that we're willing to give up in that conversation
Mm-hmm.
and what are the non-starters. I think for a long time, dairy and that whole supply management system has been a thing that we haven't been really willing to let go of. And I think the consistent position is that's here to stay in Canada. We don't really want that on the table. And so to your point, it's understanding when is our moment going to be and how long can we actually survive in this kind of limbo state. And I'm looking to, November with the midterms in the United States and recognizing the current polling suggests Trump is expected to lose quite a substantial amount of power in that process. For Canada, that's an opportunity of if we can survive till November, we see that opportunity where Trump will get a message where Republicans, his polling numbers are going down significantly,
Yeah.
using that as a leverage and saying, look, you're losing power in the House and the Senate, and you're not going to be able to have as big of a strong armed force on Canada. That gives us a good position to have a good faith negotiation with the United States and recognize, look, we want to have a negotiation. Obviously, the United States wants something that is considered fair to them and their economy as well as Canada. So finding a way to kind of return back to how we used to have it,
Yeah.
where there is a bit of more common understanding, and it's not just the United States is viewed as this big economic contender and we're
Yeah.
reliant on them and we absolutely have to agree to everything that they want without having our policy agendas on the table. And I
Right.
think that is the most critical piece for us, is being able to be patient and be willing to know, where do we draw the line in that conversation, and what are the things we're not willing to sacrifice to have a trade deal just for the sake of having a trade deal on that conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think the patience is key here. I think some of Prime Minister Carney's detractors, like Pierre Poilievre, will uh, use the fact that there is no explicit deal as a knock against him. But I'm more and more convinced that the way to deal with Donald Trump is to be a good negotiator. Stand your ground, but don't give in to the theatrics. And Donald Trump loves the theatrics. Auto seems to be a sticking point in these discussions, and we know some Brampton news, Stellantis, some big news came out that it's looking to potentially sell the Stellantis plant in Brampton, which is a divergence from what they were initially saying several months ago, that they were looking to retool that plant for vehicle production um, in the future. Unifor said no, they're looking to sell the plant. They were given notice. So I personally think that if another company can come in and provide good jobs, then we should definitely be entertaining that. Some folks say, like, the city of Brampton has rezoned the Stellantis area to only be for vehicle manufacturing. Um, what are your thoughts? And I just want to say, I agree with that. I think we should be producing vehicles. There are a lot of workers who are trained in vehicle production, but they could potentially involve armored vehicle production. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be consumer vehicles. I think that's cat's out of the bag. Rochelle, there was a Brampton Guardian piece. Rochelle is very interested in that plant. I think that's a completely viable option. What are your thoughts on how this whole affair has unfolded? Do you agree that nope, we should be producing Chrysler cars or Jeep or whatever out of the Stellantis plant, or should we be open to other types of vehicles?
I mean, I think we should be open to all types of vehicles
Yeah.
and really understanding what are the needs of the manufacturing sector. Again, going to the tariff conversation, for a long time, the conversation has been, we talk about the big line tariffs are happening, understanding that, and that is a big impact on the economy and, how businesses make decisions. But that's not the only kind of piece that goes into a business decision on where they can be building a plant and how they go about producing it. Part of it is demand and understanding consumer needs and what are the people actually buying in that area. But also part of it is workforce and understanding, do you actually have the workforce that you need to be, building out the manufacturing capacity that you're looking for. So for example, like you mentioned with the auto sector, those are jobs that are, not one to one. I wouldn't say every company has the exact same needs, but those are areas where there are workforce that is trained in understanding, how do you actually go through the mechanics of building a car or building a vehicle of some kind. And that makes it very attractive to manufacturers in the automotive sector, or like you mentioned, Rochelle, that are looking for people who are skilled in that area and don't want to have to spend months training people and building out a workforce. There's a workforce that is already available to Rochelle that is very attractive to them. And so I think that's an area where understanding that there is a workforce that is ready and using that as leverage to other companies and other manufacturers, and pointing that out, that yes, there is that tariff situation that's kind of out of our control. There's only so much that we as a nation can actually do to control that. But there are things that are in our control. And part of that is access to workforce, skilled trades, and that whole training system of how do you actually build that pipeline of training young people and building that capacity to make it more attractive to manufacturers and manufacturing sectors. That is a critical piece to the puzzle of, look, if you're going to have a 50% tariff on any manufacturing, but you have access to a skilled workforce that is ready to work, that is able to work, and that can provide you that economic boost you might be looking for and make
Yeah.
it very easy and a seamless transition. That's a way that Canada and Brampton more specifically can remain competitive in that market and understand, look, tariffs, there's only so much we can do, but there are immediate actions that Brampton can be doing. And workforce, I think, is one of those big ones of how do you actually attract investment? Show them that you have people who are willing to work and are skilled and trained and ready to be deployed at your need. That's a big piece because I know we've talked about quite a bit that training is one of the biggest costs for a lot of businesses, and it's so hard to find good employment right now anywhere. And so finding those workers who are already ready to work, who have the training that you'd be looking for, that's a way we can start to build up the capacity to attract investment, whether it's manufacturing or services. We're a different industry completely, recognizing that that is one of the biggest competitive edges that Brampton has is that human capital piece.
Yeah.
And so, how can we, as a municipality, as a province, leverage those existing abilities and continue to expand on what we already have? I think that's a big piece of how we can actually remain competitive
Yeah.
despite the tariffs and kind of ignoring that whole conversation that there's only so much we can do to control that.
Yeah. And then the last piece on the trade file is that we've spoken to a number of our members about tariffs, and it's interesting. And J. Paul has spoken to this in the past, but a lot of these discussions around competitiveness, they might start with tariff, but they end up in a very different place. And a lot of those conversations end up talking about immigration and and retention of labor. And and it's interesting because although tariff is a big sort of existential question mark, there are things that are well within our domain and our jurisdiction that we can address today. We can address red tape. We can address the sort of uh, knee-jerk policy shifts in the immigration file that has led to an uncertain workforce. We can address foreign credentialing and interprovincial trade and interprovincial credentialing for that matter. So there's a lot on the table. I think that we could pursue that can make us more competitive, and that is really the thrust of our federal advocacy. At least as we prepare our own federal pre-budget submission, we're really laser focused on the things that we can control in Canada. And the number one thing I would say is immigration. The decisions taken by the immigration minister and by IRCC I think they're devoid of meaningful industry engagement, and I think these unilateral changing of the draws, the category points that an individual can attain on their path to PR, that has led to many folks who have spent years building their resumes and their acumen under a certain set of promises to now have to study French and to figure out, move to a rural town or whatnot just to be eligible. So we need to at least let our MPs know that these decisions have real implications on our workforce. And I think for me, that is worth more of my energy than tariffs at present.
Yeah, and really to echo that, I think is the policy question of how many immigrants should we be bringing into Canada and what that number should be. I think that's a very complicated question that I don't have a solid answer to. The question that we're really asking is process, right? What is the process to approving immigration numbers or letting people into PR and understanding, okay, if you're going to make a change to the PR system, maybe the number was too high, we want to make a change, understandable. How do you actually go about doing that and making sure that you're giving a good faith effort to the people who are currently in the PR pipeline, who are, 1, 2 credits away from being able to get the invitation, who are now left on the sidelines and not sure kind of where they lie in the new system? What does this actually mean for them? And I think I look at it from two different perspectives. One from the human perspective and the actual personal perspective of if you don't actually have PR or you're in the PR pipeline and the system's changing on you every day, are you willing to settle down in any city, let alone Brampton or Ontario? But are you willing to buy a house or make those big investments because you just don't know if you're going to be able to stay in Canada and if that investment is going to pay out. Same thing with family building. Is that something that you're prepared to be doing? I think one of the reasons why Canada has such high immigration numbers is quite frankly because our population growth is well below where it should be in terms of our reproduction rate. And so that puts a big strain on the Canadian economy of we need to be able to have the human capital to fill these jobs going forward. And so if we're bringing people in but they're not starting families and we're not building out the system to make it stable for them and support them in that endeavor, it makes it very challenging for Canada to be able to leverage that immigration boost that we're getting without having a stable pipeline to PR and making it very clear on where do you actually stand in that process and what are the rules that you're going to be playing with. The other piece to the puzzle is the business side. Obviously, businesses are going to be hiring, and anyone that they hire would be interested in PR, and kind of the hope is that they'd be here long term. From a business perspective, however, because you're not able to ask, the status if you're a temporary worker or whatever it is, it's a very complicated puzzle for them as well, recognizing that there is a significant cost to training people to be working, whether it's a small business and you just need a cashier or whether it's a manufacturing job. There's a significant capital risk there for, if you invest 3 months training a person, they become fully competent in that job and they
For
become
sure.
a diligent worker. And then they don't have the PR credits, and then they're at risk of leaving the country because they're not able to be eligible anymore. You've just wasted
Totally.
how many months investing in a human capital that just doesn't pan
Yeah.
out?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And just for the record, what we're referring to here isn't the, I guess, what word can I use? The sort of buffoonery that takes place in some retail and service sectors, and a Tim Hortons as an example, or these real estate agents or politicians who fill out an LMIA and get a temporary foreign worker to be their executive assistant, as an example. This is not what we're referring to. Um, we worry that those bad actors have skewed the policy to punish legitimate contributors to our economy who are working in skilled areas, who require skilled labor, and they rely on temporary workers to fill those roles. And look, on the other end of it, people say, whenever I bring this up, they say, no, STEM and healthcare and all these things, these are prioritized in the current immigration program. And it's like, yes, sure, but the federal government's prioritizing what's called high wage top talent. So that might include the senior manager or the director, but it excludes the coordinator, right? And so these coordinators are still building the housing that we need. They're still building all of the infrastructure. They're providing the digital technology that we need, all of that, and healthcare and whatnot. But they are now in the general pool, and they have to, get a score of like 500 to be able to qualify. Whereas in the previous regime, it was a different story. So, it's unfortunate, and I'm hoping that we can spend a lot of our efforts kind of laser focused on immigration, because Brampton is acutely affected by these policy decisions. Shifting gears for a moment, we want to talk a little bit about infrastructure, and what I think stood out to me in your application for this role is the work that you did at Monk on Highway 401. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that report and sort of some things you've been thinking about since then?
Yeah, absolutely. I think going back to the previous conversation, we talk a lot about tariffs, and I think that's the big kind of headline topic, but that's something that we can't control. But what we can control is infrastructure and
Yeah.
building that enabling infrastructure for businesses. Like I said, businesses look at a lot of different factors when deciding when they're going to build a factory or a manufacturing plant. Tariffs is one of them, but also having access to a workforce and how do you actually get goods to market. The Highway 401 is probably one of the most important and most busy highways in all of North America, and quite frankly, probably the entire world, because of its connection to that U.S. export market.
Everything you're saying so far, the Premier and Minister Sarkaria would fully agree, and I agree with you for the record. But the reason I'm saying that is because the 401 has been in some interesting conversations around tunneling and all of that. So I'm very curious to see what you suggest here. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think a big part of it is, I was reading a stat the other day
Yeah.
that ex- currently in 2024, traffic on the 401 costs the Ontario economy close to $50 billion annually, and I think that's a very significant number, especially when we're talking about everything we're losing from tariffs.
Yeah.
Unlocking that potential is a very, very big piece of the puzzle for what does Canada's economic future look like. And so you can take it from a variety of different lenses of
Okay.
how do you actually work on congestion management on the 401. Obviously, it sounds easy in theory, it's a very complicated puzzle. And so the way I look at it is there's some very immediate steps that we can take to do it.
Building
One
a
of
tunnel. No, I'm kidding. Yes. Yeah, go
Yeah,
on.
tunnel that's a conversation for another day. I
Okay.
think there's a lot of evidence that
Yeah.
says that may not be the best sustainable approach for Ontario.
Okay.
But I think one of the big ways is just think about what you actually see on the 401. Accidents are a big one, where we've all been on the 401 where there's an accident or something happens, and suddenly there's gridlock traffic because everyone's funneling between two or even one lane depending on how bad it is.
Yeah.
And so figuring out, okay, well, what are the big causes of accidents? And one of those is speeding and obviously reckless driving. And so how can you actually work through that mechanism and make, fines more expensive, make it really costly for people who are actually doing reckless driving and all of
Okay.
that. So that is
Okay.
one approach to take.
So more police? What does that mean?
It's not necessarily even more police. It's more about increasing the disincentive. So whether that's making it very clear, here's the fine structure, but also making the fines such that if you're doubling the fines for whatever, right now the system is set up in a way that people would look at the fines, go, you know what, it's fine. I can go a little bit over. No one's going to catch me. If I get caught, it's a $200 fine. It's not a big deal. So making it very clear that there are going to be harsher penalties associated with it. That is one of the approaches to kind of
Okay.
reduce the amount that begin in the first
And
place.
is that effective? Has your research shown that could be effective?
So from a behavioral lens,
Yeah.
there is actually a lot of research that suggests that as you increase penalties, that there are going to be psychological effects.
Okay.
There haven't been any good case studies in a driving context of that, what that's effective, but part of it is you need to have a good communications plan that associates. Obviously, it's not enough to just increase the fines. You need to make sure that people actually feel that this is going to be a problem for them and that, we're not increasing fines with no enforcement, that there is legitimate a bit of a threat point almost with that process that makes people start to reconsider, is it really worth the 2 minutes you're saving on the highway?
Right.
The other way I look at it is looking at what exists right now. And
Yes.
Ontario has a really good tow zone program that actually makes um, clearing accidents on the highway a lot faster because how the tow zone program works is instead of letting people just choose which tow company they want to go with and how they want to kind of get their car towed off the road, Ontario gives you a strict list of, say, two or three towing companies within certain sections of the 401 and says these are the only providers that are able to do it. So that way it makes it much easier because those companies are priority for those areas.
It's interesting. I mean, this might indicate that I've just never been in an accident, but thankfully. But does that take up a lot of time? Yeah.
Absolutely. That's one of the big things of because there's so many towing companies,
Yeah.
right? It's a matter of does your towing company of choice have capacity in that specific area,
Mm.
right? And some towing companies have it, sometimes they don't. I've never been into an accident. So if I get into an accident, do I even know who I'm calling yet? I don't
No,
off
I
the
don't.
top of my head, I don't have like a towing company of choice. So I think
For
streamline
some reason, whenever I see an accident, a tow truck is just there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it is a question of how do you actually go about doing that?
Yeah.
And so right now, Ontario Public Police and Toronto Police are told here are the specific ones. So if there's an accident and you're responding, tell the person here are the only options available to you. So that way it is easier because those towing companies, because they have priority there, they have
Interesting.
capacity, they're able to
Okay.
quickly service it. And the good thing about that system is the contractor are basically set up that, your car gets towed just off the highway. And that's going to be the only part that's covered under tow zone. If you want to continue with that same towing company, you're free to do it at your expense, obviously. But it doesn't force consumers into having to face crazy prices or anything
Right.
because that tow zone program requires that the towing companies charge fair market prices
Yeah.
and are not unreasonable. But it also gives people the options of still choosing whichever towing company that they please, so long as we're able to clear the traffic in the accident on the 401. So that way it's a
Sure.
quicker clearance, it's a safer system, and it ensures that drivers are not going to be negatively impacted whenever there is an accident. So using those small mechanisms, again, that's a very small way of actually
Yeah.
going about reducing those bottlenecks on the highway 401. The other way I look at it is construction. And we have the running joke that in Ontario we have the five seasons. There's winter, spring, fall, summer, and construction season that seems to always be going on. And so how do we actually go about doing construction on the 401 or really any highway in Ontario? And for a long time, I'm sure we've all driven on the 401 where we see those long patches of highway where it seems like nobody's working. And so understanding how do we actually avoid those closures and make full use of those that are going to be critical. And so one of the big ways I look at it is looking at other countries, and Japan's a great example of it. They use a lot of prefabricated materials and bridge segments and different construction methods. So that way you're building these structures in different garages, and really you just shut down the highway for a
Yeah.
one day or shut down specific lanes.
Right.
And it's a faster way of doing the repairs that you need to be doing
Yeah.
without having to delay for months on end and cause a lot of bottlenecks on the highway.
Right.
And so that's something that I look at and say, that's another one that working with construction developers and other areas and really just understanding what are the costs associated with it, how can we do it? And a lot of the data shows that actually a lot of the prefabricated approaches are actually cheaper or cheaper or close to market rate compared to current construction approaches because
Mm.
from a developer side, you don't need to have a million different workers working at different times and going through the whole process of it. Now you can just have one set of workers working at very specific hours in a factory. It makes it a lot easier on a developer side because you can have more modular developments going on as well, which
Interesting.
is very effective and cost effective for the developer as well as for the government.
Mm.
So those are just two small ways of how we can actually affect 401 traffic mitigation immediately. And obviously, the one that we've advocated for forever is Go Transit. And that's a big one of there's a lot of commuter traffic that goes down the 401 constantly. And
Yeah.
as someone who went to U of T and from Brampton to Toronto, I always wondered why are people so eager to drive downtown, go through this gridlock traffic and all
Yeah.
of that?
It's also it's interesting because it is a bit of a dead zone, the 401 kind of catchment area, if you will. It blows my mind that there is no rail alternative
Yes.
to the 401. There seems to like the 407 for a stretch can be an alternative to the 401 at times. The 413 I think is intended to be a bit of a diversion away from the 401, but there's no rail alternative, and that's really interesting because a lot of our rail mirrors or frankly directly shares uh, tracks with freight. And in
Yes.
the case of the Kitchener line, that is the case in the CN Halton sub. And so I think if we're looking at building net new rail, like I think that 401 corridor is probably top of the list. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from both a freight perspective, but also from a passenger perspective,
Yeah.
is look, that's an area where a lot of commercial vehicles are going through constantly. Can we build out the railway system for freight traffic, but also for commuter traffic? Who, again, as someone who used to commute to the Toronto
Yeah.
constantly, it's something that for commuters, if you make it affordable for them, I think gas prices are something that everyone's complaining about.
Yeah.
If you make it present as an affordable alternative to driving to Toronto, a lot of people would actually be willing to do that as long as there is capacity on the GO trains and you're able to run service as frequently as you'd like.
This is sort of my thing about about transit. I have a friend who doesn't like the blower bike lanes in Toronto, and he was arguing that it just makes driving so much more challenging. And I'm like, look, especially on a road like Bloor, where there's a literal subway underneath, and you have bike lanes and you have like a diverse road diet and whatnot. Why are we optimizing for the car on this? It should be inconvenient to drive on this road. Well, like, yeah. Anyway, so that it just reminds me of the 401. Like, if there was a legitimate alternative to driving on the 401, I don't. Then, from my perspective, that's the silver bullet. Not the silver bullet, but it is the most. It's the biggest factor in providing maybe not necessarily decongesting the 401, but at least you provide some diversity in mode share, right? People have the choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously to the Ontario government's credit, that's one thing that they've been starting to look into is building out the rail network as well. Obviously, there's been a lot of investments in building a new highway and the 401 tunnel as
Yeah,
we teased.
Go 2.0 is yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
And there's a lot of they're trying to build that capacity for alternatives and trying to see what that looks like. Obviously, there is a lot of complexities that come with that. And like you mentioned, we are a very car centric society right now. And so there is a bit of wanting to find that balance of how do we actually build out the infrastructure we need, along with building out what we need for the future. And 401 tunnel, we might as well address it head on. That's one of those areas where they're doing the feasibility studies right now and trying to understand what does that actually mean in terms of construction and cost and all of that. But it's one of those things where I was reading a study from, I think about 5 years ago,
yeah.
where there's a lot of evidence that says if you build a new lane or build a new highway, it actually worsens
It
congestion
does
because
induce demand. Yeah,
exactly. It brings in the induced demand and it really causes a lot of significant problems because it takes away from those public transit alternatives and people go,
totally.
"Oh, it's so easy to drive on the 401 or the tunnel or whatever it ends up being."
Here's an interesting idea as well. Sylvia, who's a great transit advocate in our community, she helped me understand something that it made a lot of sense when she explained it, but I hadn't thought about it before. But in places like in Mississauga, for example, if you're driving around the through the Heartland Town Center, these are massive roads, right? Several lanes, and when people talk about road widening, people talk about it from the perspective of making transit or traffic better.
Yes.
But if you're on these roads, you'll know that it takes a incredibly long time to traverse a short distance because you're at a light and you're waiting for that passenger signal to count down from however I think it's almost a minute or if not a minute. The wider the road, the longer it takes to walk across it. So you're actually just stuck at a red light for longer. So it actually makes traffic
Yeah.
worse.
And I think that's one of those other interesting aspects for me. Like I was reading a study that was done in Japan where they actually closed a lane on a highway
Yeah.
and kind of just saw what happens.
Yeah.
And ironically, traffic actually got significantly better.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I think that example is a little bit different in the Toronto case just because they had alternatives
Yeah.
to driving so that they were able to, drivers could see traffic's not great.
Yeah.
We're going to go to other alternatives. And I don't think we're at that stage yet where that makes sense for the GTHA.
Yeah.
But the investments that are happening, we are starting to see a bit more momentum towards building that rail capacity and trying to build those alternative systems to the point where maybe we won't be so reliant on building a new highway or building a new lane on the highway or whatever it ends up being in the next, say, 10 years. So there are signs of optimism. It is good to see that the Ontario government is trying to set those initial stages to understand what does that look like for Ontario. Just
Yeah.
obviously, as we know, any construction project in Ontario takes a long time.
Yes.
And you never know when it'll be done. But it is good to see that the trend is not so highway forward and so highway reliant.
Totally. So transitioning now to the municipal election, this is really interesting and I think this dovetails quite nicely with what we were just talking about. But as a young person in Brampton, born and raised in Brampton,
Yes.
yeah. What are you prioritizing now, and what are some of the top election issues for you?
Yeah, I think there are two things that I'm really looking for from a mayor. Obviously, we've talked about quite extensively about a variety of different Brampton issues, but some of the ones that are not getting talked about enough is really understanding how is the relationship going to be with the province going forward.
Yeah.
We've seen obviously right now the Association of Municipalities of Ontario is happening right now, and those conversations where we're bringing municipalities together and understanding what does the role of a municipality look like going forward. Um, in the Ontario government context right now, we're seeing that a lot of municipalities are being agglomerated. Some of them are being taken over completely. The Peel District School Board, for example, that's an area where it is being taken over by the Ontario government.
Mm.
And so understanding, well, what does the role of a mayor look like going
Mm.
forward? What is the role of the cities in that space? Some people online and some journalists have suggested that it's starting to look more akin that the Ontario government is using municipalities as an implementation tool to kind of continue their positioning, without giving the autonomy needed to municipalities.
Totally.
And so one of the questions I look for from a mayor is understanding, well, what do you see that relationship looking like? Do you see it as, the Ontario government has this grand plan, and it's our job as a municipality to kind of sell it and package it to the Brampton audience? Or is it that your job is to actually represent Brampton and influence the Ontario government decisions to build that alignment out? That's a conversation I don't think we've seen enough of in this current election cycle. And obviously, we're still 2 months out from the election, so there's plenty of time to begin understanding that. But for me, that's a question that I've had for a long time, and I'm curious your thoughts on, what does that role of a municipality look like
Yeah.
in this current order of government?
Yeah, I'm pro local decision making. I will say I don't think it's, I don't want to necessarily flip the needle to the other side and say that municipalities should be the sole decision maker on matters that have a provincial or even federal stake. That being said, though, the manner in which municipalities have been um, completely circumvented in the process has led to a complete ostracization of community, and that's not good. And I am intrigued by this idea of strong mayor powers. I don't love it, but at the same time, I do think if you're elected at large, that you should have some level of coalescing power on council, let's say. And so I agree with you. I think one of my questions is, how would you use your strong mayor powers? Are you going to use it to increase transparency? Are you going to use it to make things more democratic and provide more consultation and to put forward pro housing policy? Which it's funny because in Markham we've seen an example of the opposite, where strong mayor powers were used to curtail pro housing policies. So yeah, absolutely, I think that's spot on. And when it comes to the role of municipality, I mean the famous adage in poli sci is that municipalities are creatures of the province.
Yes.
And I think we see that very clearly with Billy Bishop. Um, and if it wasn't for the federal stake in Billy Bishop and the tripartite agreement, that we would have seen a very different outcome. But the fact that the municipality or the province can sort of unilaterally come in and remove Toronto from the tripartite agreement, I think is um, is reflective of the fact that municipalities have no protection. Tomorrow, if Doug Ford wanted to replace the mayor of Brampton with a city manager and dissolve council, he could do that. He has the constitutional authority to do that. Um, so I think this idea of big province municipalities being weak administrative bodies with delegated authority, I think that is something of the past. That was a Confederation era policy. I think now municipalities that we should be looking at a new deal. Certainly, in some cases, I think um, I'd be intrigued by the idea of a charter city where there's actually an agreement for cities to have explicit jurisdiction over certain affairs without the intervention of a senior government. But my view is the municipality needs more fiscal options beyond property
Yes.
taxes and development charges. That's my main sort of clarion call at the Brampton Board of Trade, is that is municipalities have to increasingly face and manage costly growing problems. And we see this this is a big theme at AMO, as you referenced, but the tools to manage these growth related challenges are vanishingly little. And yeah, so I completely agree. Municipal fair. I don't know if the general electorate will necessarily resonate with that, but it's a big issue for us.
And I do think, like, again, to play devil's advocate to
Yeah.
my point, kind of defend the province, a lot of their framing has been trying to bring consistency and transparency across the province. Obviously, if the Peel District School Board is doing a spectacular job and the Toronto District School Board is not doing as good a job in implementing the curriculum, trying to bring consistency across Ontario in terms of how do you go about it. And I can understand that perspective. That being said, Brampton is not the same as Toronto. I think there's a very different, I mean, a big part of it is Brampton, because we have such a big immigrant population and first generation, second generation immigration, a big part of it as well is that, in the typical school board dynamic, you would go home, do homework, you would have your parents who are there to teach you math and
Yeah.
help you with language services or whatever it is. For a lot of immigrant children, their parents are not as well versed in English or know Canadian
Yeah.
history or all of these kind of different things.
Yeah.
And so by taking away that character piece for what makes Peel District School Board so different from any other school board, I think that is a very big piece that's lost in that puzzle of, trying to bring a standardized approach. I can understand that. But sometimes bringing a standardized approach doesn't serve every community the same way and kind of disparages, the newcomer community that Brampton relies so heavily on.
Right.
And so that's a piece that I look at and go, I can understand the rationale, but I wonder where that middle is and how do we actually work with the province to find that middle of trying to bring a consistent approach across Ontario that is still catering and unique to the Brampton needs and
Yeah.
supporting everyone, so that way the newcomer community actually feels represented and feels like just because they are a newcomer, their children will be able to get the education and the support that they need
Yeah.
to be able to be productive in Ontario and feel represented in that picture.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, I completely agree. We usually wrap up our podcast with a little bit of a pop culture moment, and I shouldn't say pop culture. I think a piece of media that you've resonated with um, in the last little while, and I don't know if you had a moment to think about it, but is there anything that stands out to you?
I mean, yeah, last weekend was D23.
Yeah.
As a Disney adult, I'm very excited about D23 every time it comes around.
And
And
you want to
so,
explain what D23 is?
yes, so every year Disney has a big conference. They do a lot of their promotional material there. They invite a lot of fans, but
Yeah.
also that's where they make a lot of their big announcements for the next few years of
Yes.
the projects they're working on, sending out some teasers, kind of
Yes.
illustrating what that looks like. And so for me, that's always a big
Nice.
theme. Obviously, there's a Marvel component that comes
Yes,
into that,
yes.
but also as someone who loves the Frozen franchise,
Yeah.
they got the first teasers out for Frozen 3 and seeing what that looks like in the story that
Okay.
they're
Nice.
building.
Nice.
But I think it's very interesting for me to see, the movie industry has been under so much strain since COVID-19 of how do you actually bring people back to the theater and
Yeah.
build that environment. I love the theater. That's I don't think that's going to change, but it's understanding what are the stories that are getting told. And increasingly, what I've been a big fan of Disney and the stories that are getting told is they're bringing maturity almost to a lot of the films that they're making. Again, Frozen 2 is a very good example, or even the Frozen franchise more generally. They talk about death, they talk about different types of love that you don't typically see. It's a very much focusing on the family aspects beyond the typical story of a princess who finds Prince Charming and kind of goes through those motions. And Coco is another really good example where it addresses the theme of death in a creative way that is very, kids may not fully understand the depth of it, but it's a movie that ages really well and you can understand that. And so to see the types of stories that are starting to get told through Disney is obviously still bringing that childish humor and that animation style, but also the themes that they're tackling are becoming more attractive to people who are maybe my age or in their late
Yeah.
teens who may not resonate so much with the princess story, the idealistic lens, but trying to really attract different types of audiences. And so for me, that was one of the things that I found really exciting about D23. And again, seeing the direction that Disney's going for the next few years. But I'm curious, as the Marvel fan, as the resident Marvel person here, what's something that you've been really fascinated by? Have you seen anything from D23 and kind of what's going on in the movie industry?
Well, I think the big news from D23 for me is the X-Men announcements,
Yes.
casting announcements. I think the cast looks incredible, very well casted, and I think the MCU does a good job of casting in general. But I think this X-Men casting is in particular, like you can tell Kevin Feige has a passion for the X-Men in a way that he doesn't have for Spider-Man, and so I'm really excited for those films. And um, spoiler alert: Sadie Sink was revealed to be Jean Grey in the Spider-Man
Yes.
film, so I think that's really exciting, and excited for her character. I think to comment on your reflection about cinema, um, it's interesting because Martin Scorsese was kind of the poster child for this, but there is this perspective that these films are not real cinema, and especially the CGI fests of these superhero films. That being said, No Way Home in 2021 kind of saved the theater industry.
Yes.
Theater, like cinemas, literally cinemas, like were bailed out because of that film. and it got people back in the theater. And so, you kind of need one to fuel the other. These like small kind of like obsession, the drama, these small like sort of indie A24 type films that for which there is not a massive market. They are largely subsidized, at least from a cinema perspective, by these major, several $100 million extravaganzas. These films that would gross over $1 billion. Spider-Man just crossed $2 billion. So it's very interesting. I think and something like even One Battle After Another, which technically flopped from a numbers standpoint, critically just absolutely adored, right?
Yes.
And that can be facilitated because studios are investing in the big Marvel stuff. So yeah, it's something to think about for sure.
Yeah, and I think I mean, to your point, one of the interesting things is we're looking at the cinema market, obviously, and people say superhero movies is like empty calories.
Yeah,
You go for just the action and the fights and all of that, and there isn't really a story being told, and there isn't that lasting impact that you typically feel. That when you think of a movie, you're like, I want to be able to look back at it 1, 2 years from now and still feel that same emotion. And some people are right. I think there are some movies where it is just that kind of context. But then you look at what DC's doing, and DC doesn't have the same kind of pull that they
yeah,
used to
yeah,
have.
yeah.
And
They're
so
kind of all over the place.
exactly, and
They
so
have
I
a
think,
Clayface movie coming out anyway. Yeah,
and I think to that point, like that is something that Marvel has done a very good job of not only building out a movie and like making those fights entertaining, but also how do you actually build that overarching story and make everything feel connected in a way that it isn't just we put a bunch of fights, we did a bunch of CGI, called it a day, and that's it. It's how do you actually build that story that there
yeah,
are those little secrets, like you mentioned with Spider-Man, finding a way to make it not just a Spider-Man movie, but building in a universe around it.
yeah.
I think that's the interesting thing that even for me as someone who loves movies, the overarching stories has always been fascinating to me. Of, you know, whenever you watch a movie, it's like they focus on that one specific story. There's a world around everything. I mean, even here now, we're having this conversation, but there's a world that's happening around everything. And so trying to build out that world, it helps attract new people who are coming in, but also it helps with the retention piece of how do you actually bring people back.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the interesting things of I don't like that the cinema industry is so reliant on Marvel right now. I like to see a diversity of movies and seeing a variety of different perspectives. And last month we saw a lot of indie movies thriving, which is always exciting to see. But it is something that also it's a double-edged sword. If you don't want to be reliant on Marvel, but also it is it has weight and it has
Yeah,
pull.
yeah, and it's also Christopher Nolan. I think. I think
Yes.
if Tarantino decides to do another film, like these films, definitely bring people into the theater. But you don't have DVDs anymore. You don't have
Yeah.
Blu-ray, right? So it's like you can't. The theater experience often is the only opportunity to make some money, and there are an obscene number of ads in Spider-Man: Brand New Day as an example, but yeah, it's interesting, and film is obviously an important industry to Canada, to Toronto, to Vancouver, but Quebec as well. Like you see the Quebec logo on in the credits of a lot of films. They have a great sort of infrastructure for funding the arts, and so it's definitely an industry that we have vested interest in for sure. Cool. Well, that was a great chat. Thanks, Fadil, for chatting with me in J. Paul's absence. Thank you all for joining us, and make sure you subscribe and you like, comment, and you can email me at vsing@bramptonbot.com if you have any thoughts about what we've discussed. But until next time, thanks for watching.